Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar of our second series of the successful initiative 2020, a year without public space under the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Luisa Bravo. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Space that is promoting this initiative together with City Space Architecture, a non-profit organization based in Italy, and the School of Architecture of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today, our webinar is on global design studio in the age of pandemics. And this webinar today is focusing on the outcomes of an international urban design workshop that took place in June while we were developing this initiative. We have today speakers from Hong Kong, New York, United States, and Auckland, University of Auckland, and Unitec Institute of Technology from New Zealand. And today the webinar is introduced and moderated by my colleague Hendrik Tieben from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the School of Architecture. Thank you for joining, and I hope you will enjoy the discussion. Hendrik?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Luisa. Before we start with our session today, I want to welcome our different panelists for today. So we have here with me Miodrag Mitrasinovic, who with me together is introducing today's event. Then we have, for the first time in our sessions, also a group of students, because it's basically also about learning activities in our time today. So we have Bianca Mukonda and Sian Singh from Auckland. And we have Terri from CUHK. Maybe you can wait so that people can see everyone. Okay. Afterwards, we will have Stephanie Cheung, who is also helping us with this initiative, but also is working with iDiscover. And later we will talk more about her presentation. Then we will have Georgeen Theodore from New York and New Jersey, right? And Seta Low from New York, from City University, New York. And later we will have Ali Madinapur, who joined us from Newcastle University, and Manfredo Manfredini and Annabelle Pretty, both from Auckland. So again, we connect the different time zones, and for our friends in Auckland already very late. So thank you very much for joining us even at that time. In addition, for the Q&A, we have Ingfen Chan. So basically, if you have a question, you will see you cannot use the chat function, but you can use the Zoom Q&A function. And we will look through those different questions, and Ingfen will select some of those questions for the discussion. And at the end, we also have a little video clip that actually Ingfen edited of the workshop. So who has interest can then still see that video. But I think I want to keep first the time for all the different speakers. Now, let me just introduce our idea for today. Wait. Just quickly share my screen. Second. Okay. Okay. So after already a whole series of different webinars, for this webinar, we want to look at the particular aspect of education and the relationship of education with pandemic. As you know, we are basically all confined to our personal homes. I think probably most of us at the moment, even most of the panelists are probably at the moment kind of logging in from their homes. And for education, the question is, of course, one of the big questions, how we can understand the wider world if we basically have to perceive the world from our little homes. Here, just refer to this very famous Alfred Hitchcock film with James Stewart and his situation after he, I think, broke his leg and had to observe then his own backyard from a small window. And we use slightly different techniques. We use basically this kind of camera, the cameras of our laptops and desktops to link to the world at the moment. For education, of course, the situation is when we look at, for example, here the sustainability goals and the goal number 4 is education. And of course, one of the issues at the moment is that many schools are closed, remote learning, and also the questions, how is the access to information, or if, for example, not everyone has actually access to safe internet access. In the preparation for this webinar, I found, for example, here a survey that is kind of interesting from educations.com, that interestingly, despite COVID-19, still many students, only basically 4.7 students of 2,500 that were interviewed across the whole world are thinking to cancel their study abroad plans. So still students are very excited and interested in studying abroad. But more and more, of course, also considering in this special situation to use digital means, and are very interested in how universities are tackling the crisis, and basically 66% are basically saying that they're quite interested in seeing more online classes. At the moment, according to this survey, 85.1% of these 2,500 students are at the moment online, and this is a survey really on all different continents. So it's quite interesting that the situation that we have at the moment in this webinar is basically a global phenomenon. And this interest of how then, of course, online materials, lectures can be provided. So most of the students, even though of course some are considering that they might even want to cancel maybe also seminars and so on, but actually most of them are quite interested in still kind of using digital means to somehow cope with the crisis. But then it's of course the question like how exactly this online teaching can be, and how this could be more successful, and particularly in area where most of us work, that is somehow related to built environment studies, design, that are on one hand very much linked to the experience of real places, and on the other hand also include design processes that sometimes are more difficult in comparison to lectures to organize online. So while we were launching the initiative with the Journal of Public Space of this 2020, a year without public space under the COVID-19 pandemic, at the same time as one of the additional layers of our initiative, so one other layer is a special issue that soon will appear in the Journal of Public Space, but another one was that with a group of colleagues, we were thinking also to set up a an experimental online workshop, because usually we take our students every time in summer abroad, but obviously that was not possible. And to work with schools, in this case, the new school, Parsons, School of Design, and Auckland and Unitec, University of Auckland and Unitec in Auckland, and the Journal of Public Space and City Space Architecture together to experiment with an online workshop reflecting on the condition today. And which was basically in a series of other workshops in which we focused on designing infrastructures of inclusion, which we developed with Miodrag Mitrasinovic, who will speak as the next speaker. On one hand, in Hong Kong and Macau, and then last year in New York. And now, of course, this had to be online. But I think this whole topic of infrastructures of inclusion became quite important, because one of the main issues became this discussion about health disparity that became so obvious under the pandemic, and how to deal with this. For these workshops, we worked on sites, public spaces in New York and Hong Kong along metro lines that connect the most richest areas with the poorest areas in those two cities, as a kind of comparative study, as I said, to somehow engage with those problems. So some of the neighborhoods that we studied in New York, around Corona Plaza, for example, were the hardest hit in New York City. And in Hong Kong, we're looking at some of the also most problematic areas with subdivided flats and so on in Sham Shui Po. So basically, the kind of discrepancy between those kind of very rich neighborhoods and business areas that often now are basically even closed off, or but also sometimes not show too many infection cases. And of course, with all those kind of famous public spaces that now, like the High Line, for example, is closed, or Hudson Yards. And on the other hand, the more kind of grassroots neighborhoods and their way how they are affected by the virus, and all the points that are linked to the pandemic, also the economic hardship and so on. So later, we will have our students actually presenting a very short summary of one of the works. But this is, of course, only one part of the discussion, because we also invited other international colleagues to basically contribute their experience, colleagues that have worked also very much with international global studios in many different parts of the world, and to reflect about how we can basically tackle those issues. Questions that come to my mind, and we might further discuss during the day, during our webinar, for example, how can we continue to provide international learning experiences? What are potentials of new online or blended educational formats? Can the new formats be used for fairer access to education? Can such formats to learn from local community be used to learn more about local communities? If we just use online sources, how can we really know about the local differences? How can we connect? How can we connect to local communities, and also scale up maybe through online means education, but particularly also in areas of design that are sometimes quite difficult to deal with online. And also how those innovations might be used to develop more place-based solutions for globally operating professionals, or even tourism, that also, of course, have similar issues, how they link to local situations. Okay, I want to stop here with my introduction and pass the word to Miodrag, who basically was our host last year in New York for a fantastic summer course and also instrumental for this particular workshop.
Thank you, Hendrik. So let me just share the screen. Share. Can you see?
Yeah.
I'll
Yes.
go to full screen. Okay, good. So good morning, everyone. I will just continue on what Hendrik already said and add a couple of things that went into the planning of global studios at in my own department division here at Parsons since 2005. So a long time, in the last 15 years, we've been trying to figure out, in fact, how to build these global studios, a global urban or global design studio, into the regular curriculum. For many of us who teach in the programs that do not have unlimited amounts of funding and cash laying on the side, and cannot pay for students to travel around the world, much of that work also included actually grant writing and funding applications for financing this project. But one of the areas I wanted to share with you, and I speak in half voice because it's very early, still somewhat early for some young people here in New York City. So I'm going to bring the microphone closer. I apologize. So one of the things I wanted to share with you is years of planning as to how this, you can see here, this is faculty manuals version 1 from July 2010. And this is basically our attempt to begin to understand how this global studio will synergize with the rest of the curriculum and who will play what kind of role in terms of program directors, research chairs, faculty, and so on and so forth. So a number of different scenarios we developed as to how to do this properly and in a sustained effort. And then that planning also went for external partnerships as well, which are local, national, as well as global. One of the modalities we developed, which was beyond the architectural tourism model and the the client model and consultancy model, was a model we called learning partnerships. And the key objective of learning partnership is simply to develop local, international, and international frameworks for the production of new urban knowledge and the new modalities of urban practice. That's pretty much the bottom line of this. So the production of new urban knowledge and figuring out how we act as urbanists in the world today, particularly, of course, now under the current situation of the global pandemic, or global pandemic, it's a contradiction, it's of pandemic. How do we develop then these partnerships? So these are some of the partnerships we developed from local to national level, and figuring out how we can actually work both with federal agencies and community-based organizations in Sunset Park or Corona Plaza, Corona Queens, for instance, but also at the global scale, where are these like-minded colleagues who, in fact, without us colonizing or being colonized or anybody being colonized, how can we, in fact, create a network with hubs for the production of new urban knowledge with like-minded colleagues, and also in very often with our alumni who are from around the world and who basically, when they go back, they get, teaching positions and research positions and so on and so forth. And so this network continuously grows. So in other words, the network is set up to, again, produce new urban knowledge, and the vehicle through which we do that is what we call the Global Urban Studio or global workshops. Now, there are a number of different modalities we have developed over the last 15 years, and some that we also did with, for example, in collaboration with Hendrik and some other colleagues in the Pearl River Delta region, are the following. And I apologize because there will be quite a few bullet points in my presentation, but I just wanted to really pull out some of the logistics and rationale for doing these global studios and how can they be done in the future. So the way we did it is because of the differences in timing, in the length of engagement during the period of a semester or two, differences in academic schedules around the world, we made a couple of decisions. First one is to partner primarily with academic partners. In other words, to find the colleagues in academia who do analogous work or similar work to the work we do here. In other words, engage to work with local communities and government agencies and so on and so forth to develop new thinking about urban issues, challenges, problems, and opportunities we all face. So once we have identified these schools and colleagues, we have tried to figure out how they organize their own semesters, how they organize their own global studios. So for example, option one is the one where we initiate a semester-long studio work on a local assignment in New York City, let's say in Corona Plaza. And we introduce the global component, which means students do preliminary research on a site or a space or territory, culture we will, where our academic partner is situated in. Then halfway through the semester, usually literally halfway through the semester, we have a global component, global module, where we used to travel to a different country, a different place, and then do a deep dive around the work that our colleagues in that particular locality do on a shared thematic, and I will cover the shared thematics in a moment. Once we return, we continue to work on our own local problem. Now, of course, having the dispositions and awareness and attitudes that reflect, of course, the global perspective and the global context in which all of these local challenges we face are framed. And at the end, we reflect on the global component, and I will show you how. In a moment, next slide. The option two was actually to have a global module in January. This is what we did, for example, Hendrik and I did last year. So global module in January, where we travel to Pearl River Delta, and then we do a semester-long project locally. We did it in Corona Plaza. And then the second one is where global component two is when our visiting partners, in this case, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, comes to the school in May, and we have another face-to-face opportunity to exchange, learn from each other, and learn how both localities, in fact, really play into larger global frameworks. And then the option three, which is the remote option that we are considering in parallel now, is to actually develop two semester-long local and global components in parallel. So say Hendrik and his team is working on the red line corridor in Hong Kong, and we're working on line 7 corridor in New York. We initiate the global comparative dimension in week 1 with the workshop. We organize a shared database for comparative work, the benchmarks, the timeline, the schedules, and all of that needs to be very well coordinated, as we have done it with 6 different universities simultaneously a couple of years ago. And then organize the shared review and the work of common publication. I will show you in a moment what I mean. So for example, this is just a quick example of what Hendrik and I were doing last year. We have, these are the flyers for our courses, the one in January, the one in May. And this is what I mean by publication, which is, I think, in the context of the production of new urban knowledge, this is absolutely necessary, which is to say, this is the way in which we then reflect on what has been learned and what has been produced through this experience. So for example, this publication will have an initial research, sometimes preliminary research, that then, as you can see on the picture above right here, is of course enriched once we are together, which could be remote. In this particular case was in Hong Kong and face-to-face. Design proposals, which I think in our case is a key component of this, because it actually begins to instrumentalize and activate some of the knowledge that is both learned through the process and the new knowledge produced. And then reflections, which come in 2 ways at least. One is that, if you can see here, each student actually writes a personal reflection on what they have learned, experienced, and how this basically affects their learning in the program. And then secondly, as a group, as a team, we reflect on what are the major takeaways from the course, what are the actionable insights, the key tenets, and how this is going to basically be brought into our local work. So very quickly, the real challenge for all of us has been to develop, of course, a global comparative framework, which I believe needs to be organized thematically. And the reason why I think it needs to be organized thematically is because that's the best way to transcend disciplinary boundaries. So if you want to have a cross-disciplinary and cross-collaborative and cross-cultural project, I think the best way to organize it is through shared themes, globally emerging themes. So, for example, and some of these you will find this is some of the, there are many more, of course, but some are, for example, the universal need for public space. The second one is pandemic regimes, which is what we have been working on right now. Climate change and global warming and how that affects public space production in local circumstances, changing notions and modalities of citizenship, democratic participation, the right to the city, which of course is also ideal because it already has a global agenda to its to the movement, right? But in some countries, we worked, for example, with 4 different universities in Brazil. The right to the city is built into the constitution in Brazil, unlike, for example, in the United States. So it begins to involve also other political and economic and other dimensions of work related to public space and public realm and public sphere, and so on and so forth. In sometimes, as we did, Hendrik and I, what helps is to have something that at least in the beginning looks analogical. And so in this case, we have line 7 and we have the red line in Hong Kong. Both of them actually even have the almost similar length, which is irrelevant really, but it does help as one of the shared points, if you will, when you begin to build something that is shared and comparative. Students develop this as Hendrik had it, and students will have it as a comparative work between Hong Kong and New York. And then some of these principles and criteria we have developed for many years is some of these things are already mentioned, like thematic frameworks. But for example, cross-cultural learning environment, what I called borrowing from Montessori system, prepared environment. In fact, an environment in which we prepare shared resources and a shared database, such as lectures and cross-disciplinary cross-cultural reader, a space for ongoing class discussions and exchange, and so on and so forth. One thing that is very important to this, particularly because on our side, I always have students from a number of different disciplines across the new school, from design, planning, architecture to transdisciplinary design, urban policy, international affairs, and so on and so forth, fine arts, and so on and so forth. It is very, very important that no specific outcome and disciplinary bound outcome and object-centered outcome is specified a priori, so that the process of learning actually can be framed so that it generates a number of different equally valuable outcomes. Who should be included? Again, a number, of course, of individuals, groups, communities. So first of all, students and researchers and faculty across the academic and professional spectra is truly, as I said before, in the university context, a cross-divisional pursuit. And then, of course, representatives of the civil society organization, the government, the independent institutions, the market sector, and so on and so forth. But also, for example, public health experts. In our case, this was obvious also to the seminars, previous seminars in this series. Experts in crime prevention and mapping, because obstacles to accessibility are very often related to crime. A public space as a product of social action, therefore obviously sociologists, psychologists, cultural specific practices and actions, therefore ethnographers, semioticians, philosophers, and so on and so forth. In closing, I will just mention these 3 out of many, which I think for this work have been very important to me. One is the propositional dimension, which of course is a characteristic of design schools because it instrumentalizes what is learned, in this case, broad urban knowledge, as a component of design activity. And that's very important. That's the key to our program, to our design-based programs, right? But it is not necessarily the key as such to all of the other collaborators who come from a variety of different disciplines. So the other dimensions, such as social and cultural dimensions, are equally important. And the reason why designing in this case, I think also plays a very important dimension, is because by actually developing propositions and developing dispositions towards propositional thinking, things are learned, phenomena, practices are uncovered and learned in ways that are not necessarily always possible through, let's say, the interviews and observations. And so you become to build together a much broader and much more comprehensive and inclusive body of knowledge than otherwise any of us would within our own disciplines. And then the discursive dimensions, there are many others, of course, social, political, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, and the discursive dimensions are also extremely important, because one of the ways in which we build knowledge in humanities and in liberal arts, but I also believe in design, is through critique. Criticism, but basically through critique. And we, of course, have in design schools, we have reviews and final reviews and midterm reviews, and we critique the work. And basically my deep belief is that this critique is aimed at the production of knowledge and not at the providing technical tips to our students. So once we have, in the global context, we have a real opportunity to use this critique as a build-up of a global urban comparative knowledge, which I think we have tried to do, Hendrik and I, but also we have tried to do in all of our global partnerships. So I'll stop there. Just a few thoughts about framing the conversation today.
Okay, thanks very much, Miodrag. So we go now, make a jump from the more kind of theoretical discussion of basically how to organize, quite interestingly, all those different layers of global studios, right to a small work of 6 days of our students that were basically thrown into this situation. But we felt that's also important to give actually some opportunity for students to be part of this discussion. So may I invite Bianca, Sian, and Terri, Handan, to quickly present like a little snippet from their work, basically, which was basically done in several days only in this collaboration.
Sweet, no worries. Hey guys, how are we going today?
Yeah.
Terri will just bring up the presentation really quickly.
Okay.
Obviously, the students only met the first time for this workshop and had basically 6 days of them, 3 days for their work.
It was a good 6 days of good experiences. Yeah. So pretty much the following slideshows, which we're going to show you guys, is just the outcome of our online international workshop that ran for about a week. And due to the scenarios that the COVID-19 pandemic had caused, we replaced the previous field research that Miodrag presented earlier with an online remote teaching class over Zoom. So if we just go to the next slide, please, Terri. So this kind of opened up an international collaboration and brought many minds together. And through this, we chose 2 places, the Sham Shui Po district in Hong Kong and Corona, Queens, New York. And from there, we kind of went onto the basic sort of research that kind of revolved around the demographics of the space, you know, looking at the income, the population, and the diversity around the area. So from that research as a group, we picked up that Corona Plaza and Corona in New York was very, very sort of diverse compared to Sham Shui Po. And not only in that, also with the public spaces and the spaces around. So if we go into the next slide. Sweet. You can just see an overview, a visual overview of where the large parks and public spaces, and as well as the type of buildings are sort of splayed around the areas that we chose to research with. So if we could just move forward onto the New York City Corona Plaza, which is another part of our research. Just 2 more slides. Sweet. So the focus of this research then shifted from that initial research to a kind of phase where we wanted to review how these spaces were made, and that kind of led us into the NGO side of a public plaza, specifically in New York for this case, where you've got the New York City Department of Transport as well as the Queens Museum who come in to facilitate this. and eventually gets taken over by local non-government organizations, which help run events and sort of push the cultural identity of the space and these open plazas. So what that there kind of enabled us to do was kind of analyze the space and kind of just look deeper, which will happen in the next slide. So one of these diagrams here is kind of just a way as a group we used to identify the different ways the public space is used before the pandemic. So as you can see, it was quite open. It was used for public space for families to socialize, music, as well as showing off cultures and sort of exercises and other events that kind of just bring the whole community together. So if we just go into the next page, please, Terry. So these are the sort of policies that were in play in New York when the pandemic happened. So non-essential gatherings were obviously postponed, you know, social distancing, public individuals should always adhere to those rules. And also it was only applicable for essential workers to kind of go out. So all of these public spaces were kind of left empty in a way. For something that brings the community together, it was quite, you know, it's not a good thing to leave it empty, even though it would spread. So if we could just go into the next page, this is kind of a overview of how the space was used during the pandemic, and it was used as a place of protest to kind of bring to fruition the immigrant rights that needed to be happening within these spaces, as well as a sort of place for gathering of prayer and sort of just to pay tribute to the people who died during the COVID-19 pandemic in this sort of small, close community in Corona. So if we just go into the next page. It's just more research on the NGOs involved during the COVID pandemic. And this page here kind of just outlines how all of the NGOs help. So I think the next page goes into a little bit more detail on what they did during the pandemic, as you've got this sort of C19 help squad, the couriers, which was Corona couriers, and they kind of help deliver prescriptions and food to people for restaurants and stuff like that there. So you've got a whole bunch of non-government organizations helping out in Corona Plaza in New York, quite specifically, is what we found out. And it was quite sort of, everyone was kind of helping each other. And if we move on to the next page, just kind of prompted us to look more into these issues. Sorry, one more page after that, and come up with solutions for some of the issues that were going on. So one solution, because of the sort of immigrant community there and the sort of price they had to pay for food as they had to keep working and everything, was possibly local food banks where NGOs could kind of donate food to the community over there on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and just allow people to kind of get the necessities they need without putting extra financial pressure on them. Another idea we had was on the next page to kind of help open up the sort of local street vendors who are in this area selling their wares, as that was the only way for them to generate income. So a rotating market of sorts where it's spaced out perfectly fine, and different vendors can come in and use these spaces and rotate around these spaces about every 2 to 3 days, just to allow them to kind of gain some sort of income. Another thing that was quite prevalent in Corona was the overcrowding of the spaces, and that there kind of prompted us to look into modular housing, as that there would be a good way to kind of prefabricate off-site and then bring it on-site for the residents to kind of alleviate the overcrowding, which also helps alleviate the spread of the virus. So with that there, I'll leave the next part onto Terry, where we explored the Sham Shui Po district in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and in Sham Shui Po, we focus on the homeless people. In 80 districts in Hong Kong, there are the most street sleepers. In Sham Shui Po, we found that we can prefer, those people prefer stay and sleep at parks and overnight fast food restaurants. These people's life are related to the public spaces very closely, and we marked the facility and the public spaces of those homeless people need to use. Some of these spaces were closed during the pandemic, and those people's lives were affected. Amy from NGO mentioned in our workshop lecture that some immediate service for those homeless people were provided by self-funded organizations in their own communities, such as support from churches and the local food stores and schools. However, mismatches of services provided by the funded NGO during the pandemic. As most of the problem from the homeless would be related to the shelter and the hygiene and food provision during the pandemic, so therefore we propose some measure to increase the its resilience level of these spaces, including at some mobile shelters and facilities in order to adapt to the need for the homeless people. And we also propose that the government and funded NGOs can work together to reduce the impact of measures to control the pandemic on those homeless people. Yeah, that's all of our presentation. Thank you.
Sweet. Okay. And I also just want to add to that really quickly. It was a really interesting experience to kind of work with students internationally and get that opportunity. There was a lot of different mindsets coming into it, and it was actually a very useful tool to kind of further our own education.
Okay, so maybe we can come back in the roundtable discussion. Also, maybe ask also then later Bianca and other maybe some questions about the further experience and so on. Now, moving on, I think we have two presentations that were also linked to what we did during the workshop. So basically the presentation of Stephanie Cheung and also from Seta Law that were also involved as people that filled in very interesting perspectives during the workshop, and we have like kind of short versions of this here. The reason why, for example, we invited Stephanie Cheung was that she's working with the group iDiscover that use online platforms like apps and so on to study local places and local culture, which of course usually gets a little bit kind of short in the study of a remote study of other places. So I would give the word to Stephanie to explain her work.
Sure. Let me share my screen. All right. So yeah. So as Hendrik mentioned earlier, topic today is really how could we gain local insight and facilitate a global design studio, which really normally is not what our app sort of presentation is about, but we will try to shed some light on this and see how we, as an online platform can actually play a role in this interesting times. So who we are a nonprofit organization that is based here in Hong Kong and work across Southeast Asia. And what we do is actually, we come from the perspective of culture and heritage, and we document what we call the soul of a neighborhood or the spirit of place before it disappears from the cityscape. So we're not talking only about buildings, but also intangible culture in terms of stories, collective memories, and people. And we document them in the format of an app, but we also go kind of in an illustrated map format, but also a lot of neighborhood pop-up events and publications. And our aim are in threefold. We really want to reach a newer generation in terms of making old stuff, history, heritage relevant to a younger generation through digitalized formats. We really want to make locals feel proud of their culture and heritage, which is often unseen and or overlooked, such as the guy on the right who is actually selling picture frames in the middle of a place called Slave Island in Colombo in Sri Lanka. And we put his story on our app as seen and on the map, and he's really happy about it because even if you're actually a tourist traveling in that area, you would not basically cast an eye or talk to him because of language issue and otherwise. So really, we want to bring footfall to this location in a normal traveling situation and make them proud. But even more importantly, maybe for this current pandemic situation and this societies, is that how can we start a conversation that's really needed in societies between different stakeholders, whether it be the residents, newcomers and old people, or whether it be expats or government departments, and NGOs and all sorts of players and stakeholders in the cities and societies. So the way we gather local insights are actually based on quite a few principles, and it's really about being local centric. So all our content are actually created by locals, our maps designed by locals, and as much as also possible, the money comes from local governments and local corporations. And this is really just to illustrate how we have been working this with a help with a really wide array of partners, so that they are the one, they are the network that feed those local insights and contents to us, be it from art organizations or NGO grassroots universities to bilateral international organizations. So this is the methodology that we follow for quite a few years, since 2014. It's about how we map, share, and protect culture and heritage. And this is really roughly the 6 steps that we've been using so far, localizing to different contexts. For the first 2 steps, revealing the neighborhood narrative and really the mapping the sites that local community loves and think that are very unique. We do it hand in hand with our local community partners and residents. So what we do is we really go to the streets. We do street station, focus group interviews, surveys, whatever that's possible in that particular community and neighborhood, to understand what is the neighborhood narrative that would otherwise be overlooked or not documented. And then we pick out the sites and the stories and the people that can actually reveal that narrative to us. And so we're not the ones who pick though. The residents and the neighborhood organizations are the ones putting their votes on what should be the stories being told on the app and in the wider community. But we serve as a facilitator and a platform for them to force out their opinions. So then we lead a team of local creatives and freelancers to document that in the form of visual, audio visuals, sketching. So this is the step 3 and 4. And lastly, we share it back to the community. As much as possible, we share it offline as an event and as a pop-up, as really any kind of forums that can reach the local community. And that we think is very significant. And at the end, obviously, we pack everything, all the content, research materials, and photos into the app, which is free for everyone to download and in multiple languages. And we share it far and wide. So that's really the 6 steps that we've been following through since 2014. So this, I really just want to show sort of a sense of a feeling of what kind of stories that we are able to gather through such a process. This is just one of the neighborhood. We also did one for Sam Shui Po, and that's why I was involved in the 1-week course, where I also share a bit of insights of how Sam Shui Po looks like from another local small businesses angle. So this is one of the stories in another neighborhood, a very typical noodle shop, but it's actually a really lovely love story between this lady and a Hong Kong guy. But also stories like this, where this is part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site in Gold Fort in Sri Lanka, where he shared with us his childhood memories growing up and the historical fabric and the urban sort of fabric that was in the 1960s and how it has changed over time. So these are the sort of stories that we are able to share and collect through our methodology. We've used this methodology, and this is sort of the insights we've gathered so far for these 12 destinations, mainly around 55 neighborhoods. And now we're trying to also add a layer to make a link to planning, placemaking. These are some of the photos in Hong Kong, but also in Yangon and Myanmar, where we're trying to also work on some of the tactical urbanism aspects. And how does it actually work? How does this cultural assets and heritage and culture relate to design and tactical urbanism? So we didn't have this intention. We didn't have this intention that there's a linkage or to contribute to that sense. But however, when we started mapping very complex, multi-layered cultural assets of the neighborhood, we realized that even before there's an idea initiation, any planning idea initiation or design ideation, there needs to be a local connection and a mapping of the social network, the urban fabric, and preferences of the residents, which is otherwise probably unknown and overlooked. Our mapping process also actually serves as a neutral platform and a topic to discuss to build trust and relationship and presence, whether it's among the social worker, among the residents or between the practitioners designers and the residents. Our output, the map, the exhibition, the app, has become name cards for practitioners to enter the neighborhood. So they would hold our map, they would walk into the neighborhood, and the shop owners would be very happy to welcome them. And also, obviously, the events that we hope spark residents' imagination and conversations. I think even throughout the design process and the implementation and management of such, the mapping process has become a catalyst for all future intervention to be actually grounded and locally connected. And it kickstarts this continuous process of co-creating meaning and cultures together with the local community. Just the last point, because I really just added this point just now when Hendrik and Miodrag were talking, really to, in this new age, responding to the new forms of tourism and new ways of experiencing a place, we're looking at virtual tour, we're looking at opening our platform to crowdsource and audio experiences. But my question really for today's discussion is, how do we leverage local insights and community networks for global designs, given that for example, we have already worked with 100 partners in the region? And how does the design actually feed back to the local community? Yeah, so that's it for today. And you can follow the app and our social media platforms through iDiscover app.
Okay, thanks very much, Stephanie. So you can see by purpose, we try to bring in both academic partners. Of course, many of us are academics, but of course, we are not the only people that work in this field, and there are actually also interesting contributions, I believe, which are more from the private sector or social enterprises that work in a with very similar methodologies, but also interesting to learn from, and maybe not something we have much time to discuss today, but of course, the entire question of the future of tourism is of course also very essential, particularly, for example, in a place like Hong Kong, which has 40 million visitors usually, which just not coming at the moment, and they might not come in the future, at least not in this number. What will that mean also, the reinvention, and also particularly for local businesses and so on, right? Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie. So during our workshop, we had another perspective that we don't have today, that was basically frontline social workers working with people in the subdivided flats that were there to give insights and share insights with our students. I come now basically to another input that we had during that workshop, but also it's basically part of this longer engagement of this whole project with Luisa and so on. It's basically with Theodore, who's basically also partnering through this with this entire initiative. Of course, with her public space research group that she founded and direct at City University in New York. And we were particularly interested, I mean, we invited actually Seta also for one of the other webinars, but today, basically because of her deep knowledge in anthropology, and obviously, and but also with the particular question that we had then also for our global studio is how can we work in general, use as designers ethnographic methodologies, which Seta has developed with her tests manual, but then also to speculate or test ways of remote ethnography that could potentially give insights to remote places for global studios. So thank you very much, Seta, to join again. And
let's see if this will work. There we go. Share. Do you see me, everyone? Yeah? Can you hear me? All right. So as was, but we need, that's right. We have a little trouble with forwarding it always. Let's see, there it goes. So very briefly, I was invited to participate one day in this global studio and hadn't really thought very much about it. Of course, I have done cross-cultural studios before, but again, as everyone said, where we actually go. And as so many of you know, I'm really concerned that we not give up on ethnography. And now that we move to a digital platform and we'll be doing classes remotely, myself included, and the commitment that anthropologists have to cross-cultural research, I wanted to begin to help or think about, and this is very preliminary, are there new ways to explore culture, places, and design? And actually, Stephanie, at the end where you got there, that I think that is one of the ways, because I guess my biggest concern when Hendrik and Miodrag came to me was, oh my goodness, you know, here's something I've committed my life to, us doing more on the ground research that's deeper and uncovers culture, and now we're going to lose it all. So this is pretty basic, but I have sat down and tried to think about what is remote ethnography? What can we do to modify something like a toolkit for the study of space, which is the test, or maybe we go from here, and that you see this just as the beginning of a discussion of what am I going to do. I mean, one thing all of the viewers need to know is anthropologists believe basically in cross-cultural research. As much as we spend one time in a place for a long, long period of time, as I've spent in Latin America and particularly say Costa Rica, the reason is exactly what Miodrag and in fact both of the students pointed out. It is indeed the principle of having worked in these two different cultures that reframes the way you think about space and reframes the way you think about design. So it's not just the data themselves, it's the experience of looking at phenomena in different places and then having this broader, I would argue, less provincial point of view that allows you to become a better designer, more sensitive to cultural difference. So in and of itself, that's an important thing to do. The question is, as a methodologist, what's this going to look like? Is there going to be, can we create a form of inquiry based on a range of remotely accessed data and procedures? And can they still be used to uncover cultural beliefs, rules? And, you know, can we together work towards finding a remote way to do this kind of ethnography? So for those of you who are not familiar, the test is this toolkit. You can find it on the Public Space Research Group website. And what I've just briefly done and what I did for the studio is talk about the pieces of ethnography that we still can do. I mean, one of the things we can do with all kinds of remote mapping. I'm hoping you can see my full screen, and I cannot up there. Okay, because I can only see it marked off. But we can do behavioral maps, movement maps, and local mapping projects. We can do them globally, remotely. These are things that we can do. We can have films and videos, all kinds of materials that we can use and create maps that are local, even if we're not in the place. Maybe it's not the same, and that's another discussion, but we can do it. And the same with participant observation. I mean, the real secret to ethnography, or the really different piece, is that you yourself try to interpret what you're seeing, and that you use your ability to understand a place to be able to get at what's really going on. Remember, you're looking for those out of awareness rules and ways of being that people can't answer when you ask. There's a lot going on in public space that so why did you do it that way? And someone will say to you, this is how we do it. So how are we going to do that remotely? Well, what I hope you can see that I can't, that there's an incredible amount of online video material. There are documentaries, there are social media, there are Instagrams of all the places that we study. And what I'm asking or suggesting is that we begin to record both the material you're using and the questions you're asking, but still taking field notes, so that if you see a video, as I have seen, of Corona Plaza, then I be actually taking field notes on what I see. It goes all the way back to those of you who know the work of William White. Remember the social, he was doing film and then he studied the film. Well, we have the film now online remotely, and we can study that film. But the important piece will be the methodological piece, is to understand it's still a subjective practice. It's not like you're going to count like Holly did, like William White, but you will try to understand what the underlying goals are. Same with interviewing. I mean, I think you already said that, that you in the global studio using Skype and Zoom can interview people. Now, it is more likely you will be interviewing the experts than locals, but as Stephanie was pointing out, and as Miodrag, is you have relationships with people there. You can, people in this environment are quite welcome to interviews on telephones and Zoom, where they never were before, because they understand this is a new world. And we have the kinds of questions we can ask that will really give us a deeper insights. And as I'm still arguing, the best way to interview would be to find a community member. Maybe they're across the world. I have a colleague in Russia right now doing this, and they became my collaborator, and you're really interviewing through using somebody on the site, but who you begin to know well through conversations. It would be like if I had, Hendrik, I want you to go and do the interview. I'm dying for you to go down. There are questions you didn't ask in that environment that I need to know, but so I can't do the interviewing, but you can. Documenting history, I think there's no question we can continue to do this. It's not an issue. And here, you know that so much of my work in Costa Rica was really, you could have done remotely by looking at the changes of the plaza over time with the kinds of photographs we now have from satellites, and then trying to find people to look. In fact, right now I am working with a woman from the Netherlands. We're trying to figure out the impact of a change in a law on vendors in San Jose, Costa Rica, and we're writing emails and Zooming people there to see if they noticed any change. And we are getting results, because we're not just asking one person, we're asking many. And then, of course, we come to the part that I'm trying to develop an expertise in, of which I'm not. But there are many people, and again, I think, I don't know where I am in time. Okay. But social media, we can be using Twitter, Facebook, we could be hand scraping. Stephanie, obviously you know how to do this. Terri, it looks you're nodding your head, so you know how to, I don't know, I yet don't know how to scrape. I may not do the scraping, but my students can do the scraping. We can use the travel site listings and ratings. It's extremely useful. We've already tried it on sites that we can't now visit to see what was happening. There are Google Maps with hierarchies of numbers and qualities. There's all the Instagram text and photograph content analysis, which would take more training than a design studio. But if one student or one practitioner got interested in a particular site, you could do that kind of analysis. And then I'm suggesting we begin to think about daily diaries with photographs of location of activities. And, you know, you have contacts in these places who are still there, and you ask them to do daily diaries, and then they present it to the group. Analysis, I think we're probably out of time, but no different than what we've done in the tests. You're still going to have to clean and organize your data. You're still going to have to write memos and code and type. What I think that the biggest concern I have is, and all of you sitting there must be thinking, is that remember that you're now, if you're using remote data, it's being produced by private companies. Those platforms are private, and all of it is going through a particular kind of filter. My answer to you as an ethnographer is the same as it would be if you went to a place. There is always something filtering what you see. So what you will need to do, if we want to have these global studios, and we don't want to lose an ethnographic component, which is what the reason I'm participating is I don't want us to lose that. We've tried so hard to get it, is that we consider multiple ways of multiple kinds of data so that we understand the bias that has been entered. Thank you. That's it.
Thanks very much. Thanks for a great presentation. Miodrag, do you want to? Oh, you are muted.
I will unmute. I'm sorry. Yes, I would like to introduce Georgeen Theodore, who is a colleague of mine and friend and a professor of architecture and urban design at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and also a director of the Master of Infrastructure Planning program there. Besides all of that, as if this is not enough, Georgeen is also a founding partner of an incredible architectural planning practice that I'm sure many of you know, the Interboro partners. So without further ado, Georgeen.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Luisa, Hendrik, and Miodrag for this invitation. It's an honor to be here. Today, I'd like to present my approach to teaching remote global studios. I've been experimenting with this format. Let's see, I think my slides are not advancing. Let's see, how do I do that? Okay, there we go. So I've been teaching remote global studios and experimenting with this format since 2014, and so I'd like to share my experiences. As Miodrag mentioned, I'm both a practitioner and an educator, and as a practitioner, I'm a co-founder of Interboro. We're an architecture, urban design, and planning firm, and academically, I'm a professor at NJIT. So over the course of my career in both practice and academia, I've been mostly concerned about public space, what it is, who makes it, who uses it, and what's the role of the urban designer in all of this. And a foundation of everything I've done as an urban designer is close observation, looking closely, hanging around, spending time in a place to get to know the specifics of an environment, not only its spatial characteristics, but importantly, how people of a place use it. And this type of close observation, reading the city, what we call detective work, offers clues about how to make a place better. So in projects, we've used close observation as the foundational building block. This way of working has guided my teaching over the years. And in the MIP program at NJIT, I've built a curriculum around these principles of close observation and detective work. And for this reason, in the first 10 years of teaching, I exclusively taught local studios. And with each course, I had exercises to ensure that students got out there, talked to people, looked at the physical environment, and searched for clues about how people use space. Back in the fall of 2014, for a variety of reasons, I decided for the first time to teach a non-local studio that we couldn't visit. And at that time, I had just completed 3 consecutive studios focused on post-Hurricane Sandy rebuilding in the metro region. And I thought it would be good to test our knowledge and skills and see how it could be applied elsewhere, particularly in the context of Delta cities and Delta urbanism. And I found a great opportunity with the first Global Schindler Award competition, which the focus was the development of an urban design proposal in Shenzhen, which, site I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. And the competition called for a framework for future development for this district here. The city was already focusing on this area in its redevelopment plans. Their emphasis was on replacing the existing uses with a new residential neighborhood, a kind of tabula rasa approach. The site was a former warehouse and a logistics zone. It was these uses were not considered the highest and best. There were also 2 urban villages that were related to the historic river system. So really a very interesting and challenging urban design problem for both the students and for me, but a new one, like I said, because I had always focused on local studios, never doing a site we couldn't visit. And teaching at a university like NJIT, we haven't had the resources and sponsorships that many well-endowed schools are able to attract. So we've never had the traveling studios that have become the norm at some schools. But I wanted to do the project, and so the question for me was how to develop a studio curriculum for a project that didn't violate my foundation in close observation, looking, and listening. How to design a meaningful urban design proposal that is rooted in local conditions and local spatial practice when we ourselves were thousands of miles away. And at the outset of the semester, I developed a series of exercises to encourage the studio participants to develop a sense of lived experience on the site. And the approach here was journalistic, rooted in cultural anthropology and ethnography. And I have to say that I'm so totally honored to go after Dr. Lowe because I just really admire her work so much. So the first thing we did was that we read Factory Girls from Village to City in a Changing China, Leslie Chang's amazing work. And her book describes the lives of young women who migrate from China, China's hinterland, to places like Shenzhen. And her book strongly influenced my thinking, and I particularly admire her use of what social scientists call the longitudinal study, following a subject through time. And I asked each of the students to identify an individual that they found intriguing in Shenzhen and to develop a visualized portrait of that individual that explained their selection. And they had to research this person using either like journalistic accounts, books, films, videos, the kinds of things that Dr. Lowe talked about. And then the students had to illustrate that person's daily or weekly itinerary. And many students examined the social and economic trajectory of migrants on the site who were arriving as factory workers and then growing into small-scale entrepreneurs. And these portraits really shaped our proposal. Another thing that we did was we spent a lot of time on Baidu, which is, as you probably know, is China's version of Google Maps. Google, and here this is the street view. One student, Lauren Martin, spent countless hours walking the streets with Baidu to better understand pedestrian mobility, and then she made a map of the pedestrian network. And one of the things that we noticed early on, that for an obsolete industrial zone, the site was very well used and pretty lively. So the site under the radar had really become a hothouse for startup micro enterprises. And so one of the drawings that we developed early in the process was what we called our clues map, which was like a kind of cloud of color-coded observations that the students had collectively assembled. And I don't have time to really go into the details here, but basically you can see some of those micro enterprises and other things that we found. And so the project in the end was called SEZ to EZX Shenzhen Crossroads, and it was really about building on what was already there, using these kind of existing agglomerations of small and mid-sized firms, clusters of urban villages, and so on, and to use that as a kind of the basis for a next generation economic zone that facilitates the growth of migrant businesses. And so this vision was not shaped by some outside approach, but really by the accumulation of clues we found from afar. And I like to call this a kind of forensic urbanism. So I am happy to say that my students ultimately got to visit the site and make their own firsthand observations. We won 4th prize in the competition. And what was really interesting is that how many of the students were surprised that their observations from afar were not that far off. They felt, they knew the site intimately, and when they arrived, it felt eerily familiar. I had initially planned to sort of present some of these other studios. I don't have enough time, but basically we used the kind of same approach of, reading other people's perspectives about the place. I developed exercises to make people really, I guess Dr. Lowe would call it scraping, but like looking for different ways to get at the people, the practices, and the kind of artifacts that shape a place. And again, I don't have time to go into the details, but here we actually watched a lot of documentaries. We looked at a lot of Instagram accounts. This page is not loading correctly, But in any way, trying different ways to see the place. And in this case, there was no Google Street View, so it really required us to be extremely resourceful. And this project in the end was really based, it was organized around water equity, and we won 4th prize, and the students got to go to India actually, and this project won the last year's Architect Magazine Studio Prize. So of course, I think it's always better to visit a place rather than to try to construct a mediated understanding. But I do believe that our method of looking from these different perspectives, really looking very, very carefully and intensively through a particular lens, has a value. You could call it an oligoptic approach in which we can see a few things well. And here, the students were forced to be opportunistic in finding ways to see. They had to look very, very carefully, more carefully than they would if they had a project close to home. And I believe they honed and refined their observation skills. They benefited from working in a familiar, in an unfamiliar context, which really broadens your perspective. And I think in the end, helps us designers cultivate empathy for what is unfamiliar, and ultimately, I think that that's what the world needs more now than ever before.
Thanks very much. Fantastic presentation. It's nice to see, and the reminder also that still how valuable actually good literature also is, right? And still books certainly have a very strong value. Miodrag?
Okay, so it's my pleasure now to introduce our first respondent, Professor Ali Madanipur from the Newcastle University in the UK. Just a very brief, for those of you who are not familiar, although I don't believe anybody is, but nevertheless, a professor of urban design and the director of the Global Research Unit at the Newcastle University, author of numerous books and papers, publications, and probably familiar to many of you are the Who's Public Space, the International Perspectives on Global Urban Development, and also public and private spaces of the city, among many others. In fact, some of the few bullet points from my presentation came from Professor Madanipur's conclusions in his Who's Public Space book by looking at comparative international perspective. So thank you for joining us, and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be part of this beautiful conversation, and thank you for all these nice presentations. I learned a lot. And I'm sorry that I don't have any presentation, any slides to show. I just try to be very quick in the very short time that I have. We know that traveling to other places is very important for the students and doing design experiments on them. It's a rich learning experience for the students, but under the current conditions, obviously, we have these limitations and we need to look for other ways. This is an unfortunate period, but it's triggered a lot of new experiments in working and learning, which shows how many of our existing habits need to be rethought. Travel is one of those habits that needs to be rethought, especially in the context of climate change, of course. Now, a key question that a design studio would have, but also more broadly would have to answer is, how do we get to know a place? Usually we tend to draw on mediated information as well as direct experience. And if we choose, though, in these conditions, between the mediated and the experiential, would any of them be enough? Remote working gives us mediated information about the world. It offers clear savings in terms of time, cost, energy, environmental impact. It is liberating as it offers endless choices for running a design studio. My graduate students who had to go away and now they are scattered in different countries for this crisis, now they are free to select any site anywhere because data collection is now remotely done. It is also liberating for other purposes. It's now I'm able to join your group, whereas otherwise I wouldn't have been. But mediated knowledge has at least 3 significant limitations, which are, I call them sensuality, sociality, and criticality. By sensuality, I mean that our relationship with the surrounding environment is multisensual. So being in a place and lingering there offers an understanding that no amount of remote collection and information and mediated information offers. It is not just by seeing and reading that we learn about a place, but also by hearing, smelling, touching, and tasting. Direct experience of being in another city in another culture and climate is very important for our learning. How does it feel to be somewhere else, especially if it is different from ours? There's always this danger that I project my understanding of things. For example, just imagine what people call poverty in the West and what they can come across when they go to seriously poor places around the world. They may project that image if they haven't been there. So being there is very significant. By sociality, I mean the possibility of co-presence, which is all about the public space with other students, other teachers, local people, and the experience of traveling with others, with the students. The university is a social space, and also traveling with others to other places is always a memory that we all have from our student days. So a primary feature of public space is this co-presence, to be with others, with friends and strangers, which is the cornerstone of this social learning and sociability, a pleasure that we see nowadays so much missing. The lockdown has shown this fear of the others, which is a kind of potential sense of contamination, but also a desire for them, which cannot be satisfied by just seeing them on these 2-dimensional screens. I ran a joint studio with MIT some years ago, and we were following the option 2 of Miodrag's list of possible options, and that was basically a blending of distance and presence. And that worked well because the students got to know each other. If you don't get to know each other face to face and go for a drink or that sort of thing, you cannot work sufficiently deeply with each other. Now, the third item, by criticality, I mean the possibility of interrogating information, reading between the lines, especially when it comes to the relationship with planners, designers, and local authorities. When I was teaching in Milan, Italy, a while ago, I asked a large group of mainly international students to produce city profiles for a metropolis of their choice. Many students relied on official information, which may just be promotional. A lot of them were brochures that they used, providing one-sided stories about places. The challenge was to help them find alternative accounts of places, which is not always easy to find from a distance. Of course, SETA offered all these wonderful possibilities of different angles into information about places. So mediated knowledge has these limitations, these 3 limitations that I mentioned, but experiential knowledge also has its own limitations. This is evident in too many examples of jet-setting consultants who, with a brief visit to a place and overconfidence in their own senses, gain a superficial knowledge of a place and come up with designs that have long-term implications for many people. And even if their teams have gathered a huge amount of information, the team leader mainly rely on a hunch coming out of a brief visit. And that determines the outcome. So if I sum up, and time is up, the crisis has pushed us to rethink our habits, including international travel, with potential benefits for the environment and all sorts of other things. We develop our knowledge of places through 2 forms of information, mediated and experiential. Without traveling, we need to rely on mediated information, but we will not experience the place directly, in this case, with our senses or through being with others, and must rely on edited representations of places. But this has 3 problems about sensuality, sociality, and criticality that I mentioned. Meanwhile, experiential knowledge is not sufficient on its own. So the need for a blend of mediated and experiential methods remain. So it's, and of course, I completely agree with a number of proposals that you made about like Miodrag's idea of theme-based projects and studios so that it creates the necessary focus. So I think I should stop here. I've got lots more to say, but time is up.
Thank you very much, Ali, for this fantastic response and a very acute, clear observations. We want to go now to Annabelle Pretty from Unitec Institute of Technology in Auckland. She and also Manfredo Manfredini afterwards were basically involved in our workshop. For me, it was the first time I worked with Annabelle, but also we had her students joining our event. And we wanted to invite her also to reflect on this experience, but then also more the wider observations on the topic of global studio. Annabelle?
Thanks, Hendrik. So we have a phrase in New Zealand, and it's a Māori proverb, and it starts, what is the most important thing in the world? And it's hi tangata, hi kandaka, hi kandaka. It's the people, it's the people, it's the people. One of the things that when I've been listening to Miodrag and the students and Stephanie and Setha and Georgeen and Ali all talking is it's talking about relationships. Now, some of these relationships, like with Miodrag, he was talking about project and cultural and discursive relationships, and relationships between the critique and review and knowledge transfer. The students, Sian, Terri and Bianca, they were talking about the relationships of the architecture and people and the NGOs and the relationships of the urban space. Stephanie talked about the relationship of the culture and the heritage and the placemaking. And Setha talked about ethnography and reframing relationships and thinking about how to look through different filters with different data sets and thinking about that. Georgeen was talking about her detective work and thinking about the relationship of empathy as it comes back out. And Ali wrapped it all beautifully together with talking about relationships and being in the place. And being in the place defines the studio. So to kind of wrap up, because I like brevity, is that global design studios, they work if there's a will of the relationships of the people that want to make it work, and it will work.
Thanks very much, Annabelle. Manfredo, you also joined this joint studio, but also other joint studio that were organized in place, traveling between Auckland and also Hong Kong and Macau. You have some reflections on?
Yes, yeah. Thank you for inviting me, Hendrik, Luisa, and Miodrag also for giving this great introduction to this studio, which was particularly interesting. Interesting because gave us a particular condition for really reflecting on what is going on and how this thing which is particularly, how can I say, common to us. If I'm looking at the people that are the panelists, particularly most of the academic people today, we're all migrants. And so we kind of realize we feel very deeply this condition of being somehow displaced, separated, in one way very well connected to particular places with which we have strong and continuous collaboration. I think, for instance, of Hong Kong, and with Hendrik, we've done not only Macau, but a lot of other small things that are going on in parallel, both in teaching and research, which often get confused, particularly because working with postgraduate students, but also because that's actually what makes us passionate somehow. Well, ethnographers or botanists of the asphalt, maybe, as Benjamin would call I would call myself anyway. in a way, kind of person trying to really appreciate places. But what really struck me is the fact that this particular moment and this particular opportunity give us the possibility of really reflecting on what is happening. And what is happening on one hand in this particular moment in this part of the world, I'm talking about Australia and New Zealand, is that we realize how this system of, say, translocal capital that is really impacting on what we are doing on our everyday practice. You probably heard that a large part of the top universities in Australia are really struggling because they lost essentially 40–50% of their revenues, given the problem of international students not being able to reach the universities. And you heard probably how that will impact in the future on the way in which offshore teaching and other systems that probably are specific of this dimension of globalization in teaching and learning are actually going to transform the way we work in our everyday practice. And I think that this particular workshop allowed us to probably try to withstand to these particular forces that somehow creates a sort of discomfort and problems on the everyday practice we have. And I guess that we tried in one way or another to do something against this sort of globalization and this sort of, transforming in places of exchange, moments of exchange, something which in reality creates values that more and more tends to be generalized and to lose the dimension in which they really grow and the embeddedness, if you want. And what we've done there was actually, as we've seen today, we heard from students and also from others who commented on that, is exactly that this small thing that we did in few days, actually was probably too short, but there was enough probably to start a conversation, was exactly what we already heard. And I guess that Miodrag was very right in saying that well, in reality, what we were doing was looking at establishing a platform for interaction, for a dialogue, and probably was an infrastructure of inclusion in itself, a sort of virtual space in which we were trying to really include, and more than really try to find design solution, what we were about was, what all was about was to try to differentiate, to understand how these particular elements that constitute relational power are actually determining some particular condition, spatial condition that we have to address as designer, urban designer, object, product designer, whatever, and that in reality becomes so acute and so obvious during a period like that one in which we see people that all of a sudden become homeless, or that all of a sudden live on mutuality and mutualism happening in communities that, of course, are not the ones where such kind of things are supposed to happen, so Hong Kong and New York. So, but without further ado, I say that the result, I guess, this studio probably achieved is really to make more obvious how we really, as academics, I'm talking now in particular, have to really take a position, take a stand against a form of say globalization or globalized education in which probably we end up being in trouble and being somehow accomplices of a machine which is not the one we would like to participate in. Thanks.
Thank you, Manfredo. Our time is almost up. However, I would still like maybe to give one question to the entire panel, but particularly also our students like Bianca and Terri and Sian, because you stayed the whole time also here and were listening. Now, obviously, one point that I find is very interesting is like, of course, we all want to travel and take students somewhere, discover the world, and also ourselves, we like to do this, right? But now with this experience over the last, for us in Hong Kong, it's kind of 4 months of online teaching, there are also certain elements that are actually also interesting. Some of them, they are even more, potentially even more useful or quite likable, in addition to observation of real sites, right? So I want to ask the students, and maybe also particularly also Bianca, that travel already like from her home in Zimbabwe to Auckland as a student and so on. But also then maybe whoever want to comment on this. Now, when we design the next studios and so on, right? Which elements, of course, we want to travel, we want to really experience the other places, but which are the elements of this kind of online experience that maybe might be actually even good to take on into our curriculum to kind of reinvent teaching as kind of positive aspects? We know about their limitations and so on, but which are the ones maybe that are powerful or interesting and could be used? Do you want to comment on this, maybe?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think the different the tools that we have today, like the technology that we have, is very useful in terms of collaboration, and as well as different ways of gathering information. Like the others have been saying, how can we really get to get a sense of the place without actually being there through other people and through other people's stories? So I think those are really things that we could use more of, since we can't really go anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and especially in situations like this, I guess using tools like OpenStreetMaps, Google Maps, and just looking at news articles of how locals interact with certain areas really gives you a sort of intimate insight into how things are used, even though we're not physically there. It does actually feel like we were kind of placed into that sort of site. It got quite detailed, and another thing that was quite cool was just how easy it was to work internationally along with other students. With like using just technology as Zoom and WhatsApp, everyone just got quite familiar with each other really quickly, and it was just easy to kind of pick up and work along with each other.
So, Hendrik, if we can step in a second, something that I want to add to what I said before, and probably trying to answer or articulate what both Seta and Ali mentioned before, is the question of how probably we can start experiencing things using the complexity and the multimodal way of accessing places nowadays. So it is not only working on the crowdsourced data, which is what I'm trying to do using Instagram and other things, but it's also using the quantity of ways in which we can be, say, transducted through spaces, not only creating a space, a bubble in which we work together, as Sian was saying now, but really accessing places in a much more complex and intimate way that, well, as Ali was saying, so we probably will never be able to feel the smell and taste the food, but in reality allows us a complete different ways of approaching that, just, you know, the 2D images of photos or whatever it is that we see for Google Street View.
Terri, did you add also something still to say from the Hong Kong side? Or are you muted? No, I think we cannot hear you, or maybe I should move on. Okay, if not, I saw that from the questions, I think there are not so many other questions that came from the attendees. Is there any further comment from our great panel on this aspect, like how we can kind of reinvent teaching, basically using all the experience that basically Seta was describing so well about anthropological work and so on, and now these kind of other new experiences. Any other kind of comment on this? Yeah, Georgeen? Mm-hmm.
One thing that I've been thinking about, and this is not yet incorporated in my teaching, but it's in my work, in my practice, is that as we really depend on these digital interfaces, we know that many places don't have access to broadband technology. For example, I'm leading a very big project in Detroit, and we have to shift a lot of our engagement online or to alternative methods to the traditional face-to-face meetings. And in that city, 40% of households don't have broadband internet. So I think that I would just like to emphasize that, one, every type of interaction, well, let's say any kind of media technology that we use is not neutral. It definitely has its prejudices and its filters. And second, that we should really look hard and think about other ways to gather information that fills in those gaps of people who don't have, who are not connecting through those digitally based platforms.
Yeah, I think this is maybe a great way to finish also maybe this discussion, because we are already also over time.
Oh, sorry, Seta wanted to say something.
Oh, sorry, I missed you. Okay.
No, just no, I agree, but no, the point is, and it's to Ali and all of us, is I think we're going to have to think through the mediated real relationship. I think that that's absolutely critical, that if we are going to go in this direction, that I do believe that there are ways that we can be critical by using multimedia elements. And I think that, I just think we need to have a workshop on how we're really going to do it. I think we were offered a proposal, and I think we take it and we begin to work on it. I think these are critical issues. And as we go forward, I think we have to understand what representations and what mediated knowledge means. And as flawed as it is, it's, as you know, real knowledge is also not so real. So, you know, I think a discussion is really critical on this, that's all.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Can I just thank everybody also from my point of view? Thank you so much. Very, very productive discussion. Talking about the production of new knowledge, this has been really a good exercise in learning. I've learned a lot. And I just in concluding one line, I think between the mediated real and the blended that Ali proposed, I think it's really not either or. Everything we touched upon today really has to be taken into account in blending different kinds of modalities of work through remote global studios. Thank you so much from my point, and sorry for going over time.
No problem. I give to Luisa for basically two more things. Luisa will help us to announce the next events in our series, and for those that still want to see it, then we actually prepared a little video clip of our workshop, which is I think 3 or 4 minutes, that I will then play at the end, but who already feels it's quite late and so on can then move on, but for those that want can still watch this. And then thanks from my side also to everyone, Ali and everyone for contributing. Okay, Luisa?
Thank you, Hendrik, and thanks everyone here, all the speakers and attendees. Actually, the discussion was very productive today, and I would like just to close by saying that City Space Architecture, which is the publisher of the Journal of Public Space, is trying to start a brand new program related to teaching, blended learning, which is the Public Space Academy. So it's an educational program entirely dedicated to public space, applying the perspective that you were discussing today. So this was very helpful also for us. I mean, because we are still discussing how to, because it's not easy, as you can imagine, but I would be glad if all the speakers engaged today in this very nice discussion would help us to, set up the academy and then become teachers in our academy. So let's stay in touch, and thank you again for this webinar today. So just a short announcement regarding what we will be doing in July, because this webinar is the last one of our second series in June. We are starting with the next webinar. You know that we have webinars every Thursday. So the next one will be 2nd of July. It is the first one of our third series. It's on designing healthy communities with partners affiliated to World Universities Network from University of Sydney, University of Auckland, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And we'll engage designers and health experts. Then on the 9th of July, we will have the third webinar on innovative approaches and creative practices in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the program of the webinar will be announced soon. I know there is a lot of interest regarding this specific webinar, and we are managing, the way we organize this webinar in order to have speakers from different countries, backgrounds, and mostly related to art and activism in public space. Then the third one, which will be on July 16th, is hosted by Stuttgart University, and it is on the role of digital neighborhoods during the pandemic. And so we will be discussing again about digital resources and digital modality to be in touch with others. We will write soon programs on our website where you can find all details related to our initiative. We will also publish soon the video of this webinar, because all our webinars are recorded. And you can still apply to become a speaker in our webinars, and your feedback is very welcome. You can give us feedback regarding this webinar so that we can improve the way we discuss this idea of 1 year without public space. Okay, thanks again, everyone. And now we can watch the video.
Yeah, thanks very much. So basically, this is like when you have the film at the end of the film, there comes like some final thing. So if people want already to leave, I know for some people it's very, very late, for particularly our friends from Auckland in the middle of the night, and others might not even have had breakfast. So feel free to leave, but I will leave this run. And maybe it's just a kind of nice way to end this session. Just let me start. And thank you again for all the contributors today and the attendees, of course. Okay.
Are we offline now?
Not yet. I will still keep this offline, but you can go offline if you will. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you all. Talk soon. Bye-bye.
Basically, this workshop is a kind of follow-up on workshops that we...
I see.
Now, for this summer, we also had a tour, which was actually to go to the Biennale in Venice. Now, as I said, so basically, what happened was that we got into the pandemic, so it was no more probably possible to make any travel.
I think what is the most rewarding thing for me in this work is also trying to figure out what are the grounds for comparison, what are the criteria for developing comparative study of global cases or of global public spaces, if you will.
How was actually missing, what was missed by people at the common.
As for interviewing, I think it's possible while through WhatsApp or FaceTime while in it, or you could be doing interviewing by Zoom when not in the space.
That is important here is especially not look at the last 2-3 months, 4 months only. Look at it from the perspective of how cities need to deal with health issues in general.
Of course, the idea is that everything is internet-based, so you can use everything on the web browser without installing expensive software.
One of the proposals we thought of was community food banks. Community food banks kind of are sponsored by NGOs who can supply like food supply boxes every week or every 2 weeks to kind of alleviate the pressure of the immigrant community having to buy.
Okay, thank you very much, and see you next week.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.